and welcome to the Special Needs Sibling Podcast, where we talk about what life is really like as a sibling to someone with special needs. I'm your host, Charlene, and today our guest is Gina. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So can you please lay out your family structure, like birth order between your sibling, and then what disability your sibling has?
So I am the second born in my family. My older brother, Alan, had Prader-Willi syndrome, although, to be honest, we didn't know that he had that until he was an adult. So growing up, we knew that he had disabilities and special needs and some high medical needs, but there wasn't really a name for it. He was born breech and the umbilical cord was around his neck. So I think most of the doctors assumed that he had just lost some oxygen and that he suffered some brain damage. And it really wasn't until, and we grew up in the 80s, so there wasn't a lot of genetic testing happening at the time. And it really wasn't until he was in his 30s that he saw a new doctor who kind of looked at his constellation of symptoms and identified that it could be Prader-Willi, which coincidentally was around the time that my husband and I were thinking about having children. So they did some genetic testing um, for my brother, which validated a lot of what we experienced with him, and it also gave me some reassurance because Prader-Willi, for the most part, is a spontaneous mutation on chromosome 15. It's not something that's typically passed down. So anyway, but so Alan was my older brother. He was 3 years older than me, and then we had a younger brother. We have a younger brother, who's a couple years younger than me, who is typical. So family structure is an interesting thing. I'm sure a lot of people can relate because even though Alan was 3 years older than me, I developmentally, I passed him pretty young. So I was a middle child, but I was also kind of the older child, and my parents split when I was very young, and my mother had some untreated mental illness that made it hard for her to be a consistent caregiver. So I stepped up at a very young age and took care of my brother quite a bit.
Yeah, that's tough. That's like it's a lot of things, but it's so interesting because it's you didn't have like a label for it, right? Because you knew what you needed to do in order to like take care of Alan. But that's crazy that he went through basically his whole like well, you all went through like basically up until your adult lives before you had like an actual official like name for the whole thing, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, and I don't know that it would have changed anything. I think it could have opened up some different treatments, although they were still developing treatments, and even now I know there's some clinical trials for people with Prader-Willi. Um, but it's like you said, there was no context, there was no handbook. I think for a lot, and genetic disorders present very differently. There's kind of a spectrum of symptoms, and some people have more severe presentations than others.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, there wasn't something that we could look at and say, "Oh, we can expect him to reach this developmental milestone, or this is what his future might look like, or this is what his life expectancy might be," because we didn't there was no label, there was nothing, there was no reference.
Yeah, or even like, oh, hey, like, because you have the label, like, here's some other families that, like, this is expected behavior, right? Because you're kind of like, if he just, like, threw a chair in the room, you're like, well, that could be him. That could be, like, the disability. That could be a combo, right? There's all these kind of other things where you're like, I guess it's just it's your new normal, even though you guys don't even know if it's normal, but it has to be because you have to normalize it. Otherwise, then you guys can't function as like a family. Like I
Yeah.
think that's fascinating. Like yeah, the idea of like normalization like was so intriguing to me when I started to go to therapy because I was like, oh, like the things I experienced in my home weren't necessarily normal, but like it's these things where it's like counterintuitive, right? It's like I feel angry and in my home I don't feel like I can feel angry. But so I've normalized, oh, I shouldn't feel angry. But the real thing is that it is normal in the real world to feel angry. So
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, it's like you're like normalizing to the wrong like calibration basically, where like oh, like in a regular healthy household where it's just everyone's like neurotypical, like these are expected behaviors. And you go to like any disability of any form, right? Whether there's a label or not, and it's like, well, it's like a whole different world of emotion that is not not normal. I'm using air quotes with that.
Yeah, we could talk about normal. I mean, like, I think a lot of people would say that there's no such thing as normal anywhere, you know? So, but I think what you're talking about is it okay that we're experiencing these things? Or is it typical? Is it expected? Am I alone in that? I think that's really what it comes down to. Like, am I alone in this experience, or do other people have this experience? You touched on it a minute ago, but yeah, we didn't have other families. I didn't know of other siblings. I didn't have anyone in my life saying, well, first of all, I never had anyone sit me down as a kid and say, "Your brother has a disability." Um, you
Right.
know,
Yeah.
There's some things going on with your brother, and this is why, things are tough right now." Like, there was not a lot of communication to begin with, and I think some of that was the '80s and doctors and families at that time, but I think some of that was very specific to my family. Um, but yeah, you mentioned, throwing a chair, like, there are things that we just kind of labeled as bad behavior from him, or things that we expected him to grow out of, or things that we thought eventually he would be able to control. And now, given what I know about Prader-Willi, I realized, oh no, that was part of the condition. Like, obsessive compulsive tendencies as a hallmark. People with Prader-Willi typically have an insatiable appetite, and so because it affects um, your hormones and I'm not a doctor, but I think it's the thalamus. It controls basically like hunger cues and growth hormones and
Oh, okay.
behavioral kind of impulse control type things. So
Yeah.
he we had to control food in our house so that he would not eat himself to death, basically. Like we would catch him, getting food out of the trash, or
Oh no. Okay.
he would get violent about food, and just didn't have the cues to tell himself, his body couldn't tell him when he was full. So there was a lot of things that I think if we had had some knowledge and some context, I know for me, it would have been really helpful. I had a lot of compassion. Like, I think as a kid, I understood that he couldn't control himself and that it wasn't his fault. But I think it would have given us even more compassion for him if we had known, just how central it was to his condition.
Yeah, because then you just yeah, it's just having the context is just helpful. Because it's yeah, because even small things like, oh yeah, like people who have the same disability, even if you don't have a name, like, oh, they all tend to do this. And then you go, oh, okay, like he's just it's like my brother doesn't hate me or he's just really angry, right? There's like a reason why. Like it's he doesn't want to be angry, but other stuff is like causing him. Yeah, which it's been so interesting, which I mean, we're at a very different time now when kids are getting diagnosed versus the '80s. It's like so many things have changed other than just like genetic testing and stuff, but it's the amount of people or sibs specifically I've met that are involved in like early intervention is a lot. Like so many sibs and it makes sense, right? Cuz it's kind of like we grew up in a time where like early intervention like didn't really quite exist, which my sister got diagnosed in the '90s. So like what like yeah, it was slightly different from me growing up in the '90s and 2000s than you, but it's still kind of they're similar in the sense of parents had limited resources, the internet wasn't as big as it is, support groups were only like they didn't you didn't have the like oh this mom like across the country is feeling the same thing, right? Like the support infrastructure was unless if you met someone at like a therapy appointment you wouldn't know about it, right? And so it makes sense that for us now as adults like, to be able to change the infrastructure to say, "Hey, like, you as new parents should really, like, have like, giving them the tools to have the language to tell their neurotypical kids, like, "Hey, this is, like, why it's happening, like, this is okay, like, you can feel these things, this is what we're gonna do to help your brother or sister," and like that it's just about, yeah, creating empathy, like what you're saying. It's like having empathy to like understand, like they don't have to know what like the whole like the scientific reasons, but it's just knowing like, oh, like when my brother's upset, he does these things, and that's okay because there's other people, and then like then you just yeah, just having context is so helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, my understanding with Prader-Willi is that I think it was first named in, like, the 1950s. Somebody identified these symptoms and gave it a name, and then I think the gene was identified in the '80s. Um,
Okay.
and my brother was born in the '70s, you know, our childhood was mostly the '80s, and so he wouldn't have had the genetic testing, obviously, when he was little, um, and when he finally did get tested, I think it was the early 2000s. So, that's kind of the evolution that I saw, and I think now what happens is there's more testing readily available for infants, but I also think and hope that parents are able to ask for it more readily. Like, I don't think my parents knew to ask because
Oh, interesting.
it just wasn't common to look at genetic things, aside from maybe Down syndrome or things that people were more aware of.
Yeah, genetic like I know very little about it other than that people the I think the most common scenario that I will hear people talk about it is like kind of what you were kind of like what happened to you, right? But like on a different scale where people are like, "Oh, someone in my family has XYZ, and I'm going to go get tested to see if my children are going to have XYZ," right? Whether that be a disability or some other like, disease of other sorts. So that it's yeah. But we're talking about a plethora of things, which is always good. Is there anything specific that you would like to bring up on this podcast? Because I really don't have any rules other than you have to be a sip, which you are. So,
Well, I mean, you know that I this is a topic that I write about. I'm a professional writer and I've written a memoir about this. And the reason that I like to write about it is because I feel like there hasn't been enough conversation around the sibling experience in terms of kind of the nuances of um, looking at both the joy and the heartache of the experience.
yes.
You know, I mean, that's the thing that I get excited about talking about the most because I think, you know, when you grow up in this situation, especially when your family is just really complicated. In my case, that wasn't just my brother, but it was also my mother's mental illness. There was divorce. There wasn't a lot of community support around us. And so you grow up thinking, like, how do I make things easier for everyone else? How do I take care of everyone else's needs? How do I bypass my own needs or, you know, put them on the back burner? And so, yeah, when I write, I'm writing to a younger version of myself that kind of needed permission to feel the whole spectrum of feelings, not just gratitude for my able body or gratitude for all the wonderful things that my brother taught me, which he did. Um, but like the both and of the situation, you know, I loved my brother dearly. He passed away suddenly at age 43. Um, I loved him and I was terrified of him, you know, and um, the interesting thing when you have a complicated relationship with somebody is that it doesn't become any less complicated when they die. So so I don't know. I mean, I as a sibling, like I think even though I understood my brother's limitations, especially his intellectual disability, even though I understood that it was probably never going to be possible for us to sit down and talk about our difficult childhood. We would never be able to talk about what we meant to each other because he didn't really have the language for that. I think when he died, what I realized is I still wanted that. Like, I still wanted to know, did he know that I loved him? You know, did he feel that love even though there was conflict there too? Did he understand that people could love him and also fear him? I didn't have enough insight into his interior experience of the world, you know? So yeah, and when somebody dies, you're kinda left to kind of make that meaning for yourself, and so that's why I like talking about it now because I feel like one of the ways that I make meaning out of it is by trying to honor him and honor our relationship and maybe hopefully give a little bit of encouragement and hope to other people who can relate to this experience.
Yeah. So many good things. So many hard things. Like it yeah, because it's one of the reasons why I started this podcast to begin with. Because I had hit this threshold where I was like, like one of the components was like, I'm tired of everyone just saying, "Oh, like you're so lucky to have your sister. Oh, your parents are so lucky to have you. Oh, like you're such a good kid." Like right, like I was like, I finally hit this threshold when I like was an adult and working, right? Like when you don't live with your parents and stuff. And I was like, like I don't. Why doesn't anyone understand? Like that's not what I want to hear, right? And other Sibs would get it, right? Like if we had met before, like we would have still been able to relate with that. But it's one of the I was like, this is not like it's so frustrating. It's like, I'm tired of going through like my schooling and work and whatever, and I'm like, okay, not work, but more I think I felt it the most like in school, right? Where it's like I have all these feelings and things going on, and like that's a bad time for all humans on the planet at between the ages of like 12 and 18. Like, that's rough for everyone, but like for us it's like we're like really many adults. And then like that's a joke. And I think that it's this weird thing where like it is a joke, but it's funny because it's very true, right? Any sibling between the ages of 12 and 18, that's a typical sib to someone with a disability. Like they really are like they're like a functioning 20-year-old without all the tools of a 20-year-old, right? Because we're really taking care of everybody else. Like whether it's your parents, your siblings, your friends, right? Because the thing is like what we were talking about earlier, right? Like normalization in your household where you say, this is normal, right? If it's normal for me to take care of everyone else in my house and not me, of course I'm going to function like that in the outside world, right? Like there's nothing that's telling me, oh, you don't have to take care of them, right? And even like I've met people and even my parents, right? They've all said, hey, like go have fun, do these things. But the thing is like, that's not the same thing as like saying that every once in a while is very different than your parents or aunts, uncles, friends, whatever showing up in a way that demonstrates to you you don't have to take care of us. Right? They're not the same playing field.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a subtext when people tell you that you're lucky to have your sibling. There's this subtext of you better not complain because look how lucky you are, or there's just no room for multiple feelings to exist at the same time. Like, of course, you and I probably do feel very lucky for our sibling having had our siblings, you know? If I feel lucky, and
Yeah. Yep.
also,
Yeah.
um, it was really, really hard, and there were moments that I really, really wished he did not have that disability. Um, but yeah, it's like when somebody tells you that you're lucky or gosh, your sibling has taught you so much, it doesn't leave room for you to express the painful parts of it. And and then to your other point about the caretaking thing, there's just this unspoken pressure. Like and I've seen it in some families that I've encountered, I've seen it where it's not just unspoken, it's overt, like you will be your sibling's caregiver someday. When I die or when I'm, too old to take care of them, it's you're on
Like
deck.
it's on you. Yep.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so, Yeah, and in my family, I was cooking dinner and cleaning and taking care of my brother's physical needs from the time I was, like, 6 years old, and the only way that I was able to kind of find some space and take care of myself was by moving out my senior year in high school, and so, I actually left home. I got to a breaking point where the violence my brother's violence was too much, and I wasn't safe, and I needed to think about, okay, I can either stay home and take care of my brother, or I can look at going to college, and, so I actually had to kind of break away from my family in order to learn how to take care of my own needs for a while, and I still was even at college, my mother called me and asked me to come home, to drop out and come home and take care of him, so it's a difficult thing. I think a lot of siblings have to learn, um, you know, how much of ourselves do we sacrifice to our families? Is it okay to take up space and have a voice and take care of ourselves? Is it possible to love somebody and also need distance from them, you know?
Yeah, and I wanna say, like, that's so important for any sib that, like, is struggling with, like, "Oh, like, I want my own space, but, XYZ," like, it's okay to be away, like, you don't, because even me and my sister right now, like, we are somewhere in the 600 miles apart distance, right, and that's something I would have never imagined, but I gotta tell you, like, being that distance away from both my parents and my sister has done me, like, a world of good. Like, it's not, yeah, like, I would have never imagined being ever that far, but, like, I also would have never imagined this is what my life looks like now. Like, it's so different in such a good way, right? And it's so easy to, like, feel the guilt of, like, "Oh, but, like, who's gonna take care of them?" And, like, "Oh, but I do it better than everybody else," right? Like, every sibling thinks that no matter what, because it's like, because especially, like, if you're just, like, another mini parent, you're like, "Well, I know them inside and out, and I know how to take care of them, and I know how to take care of my parent," right? Like, like, the whole house, the routine, and it's just like, well, it's like it's just it's ironic because it's like, you both need this space, right? Because my sister's also doing super well, right? Like, she's living her life doing her own stuff, and, like, everyone in my family's better for being apart. It's very strange, but it's, like, counterintuitive to what you feel, because it's like the pull to want to stay is so great in a bunch of, yeah, in a bunch of, like, there's guilt in there, and there's kinda like, but that's the whole complexity of, like, you love them so much, but at the same time, like, you have to love yourself either the same or more in order for you to function. Otherwise, you can't even give them anything, because then you're not okay, you know?
Yeah, you don't have if you're not healthy, then you're gonna be limited in how much you could support someone else anyway. So, I think, and I also wanna say that it's not a binary, it's not an all or nothing situation. Like, for me, I definitely had to go through an estrangement, like a no contact with my mother, although I always was in contact with my brother. I would contact him through caregivers, and I would get together with him even during periods where I was not in touch with my mother. But I just want to say, like, I think it can look different for different people. I think you can get some space to take care of yourself so that then you're more solid, and then you can decide how much of yourself to give, and you'll be giving hopefully from a healthier place than if you were still enmeshed with the family. And so I think a lot of siblings kind of had to find that calibration for themselves and how much time they need for for their own self-care and their own independence. And they also, I feel like, should have those conversations if they can with their parents about what the future looks like in long-term care, and if there's options out there that would take the pressure off of the sibling to be the primary caregiver. Because my hope is, and I know it's different for different geographies and different families and different resources, but I've seen some hopeful trends in terms of, group homes and options for families that would help people kind of share the duties.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing is like that there are options, right? Like you it's up to your family like if you want to utilize one of them or not. But I think a big thing is like just to explore what's out there cuz you just don't know, right? Cuz especially now like group homes like even like 10 years ago is not what it was. Like those are very different times, right? And it's like and I think as more like people who have been diagnosed with a variety of disabilities are getting older, like there has to be some sort of movement to different types of group homes and other options of caregiving, whether that's like, hey, they just offer more options for people to like, hey, we can hire in home care and it's through like this organization instead of me just hiring like one random person that I know. Right? Just even infrastructures like that are still relieving because even as a sib, if I go, hey, if I can hire someone, they come in for this time of the day, that I can go do something else, right? Even stuff like that, which for not it wouldn't work for everyone, but at least it's an option.
Yeah, and I mean, I wanna say obviously that, you know, there's an element of privilege for some people in that too, you know? I mean, I know not everyone has those opportunities. There's some towns where there's subsidized care that's available, and respite care that's subsidized by the state. So, I think that there are options out there, and it might look different for different families. But yeah, I mean, I think like you're saying too, like kind of getting creative about what that might look like, um, and just having those conversations. I mean, you don't know what's possible until you kind of have the courage to talk about it um, with the family members that would be involved.
Yeah, there's so much that comes with caregiving. So back to like the estrangement part of it. So, I mean, when your brother passed, I'm guessing you had to go back into contact on some level with
Mhm.
your family. So, had you been in contact with them before that had happened at any like consistent level, or was it kind of like all at once when that happened?
I've stayed in contact. Really, the estrangement was primarily between my mother and I. So I was in touch with Alan, my older brother, you know, like I said, through caregivers. My husband, honestly, like, would sometimes be a mediator and call and arrange visits, um, so that I we could continue to have a relationship with my brother without interacting with my mom as much. And then my dad and I, you know, have stayed really close. He, you know, I think I mentioned before, my parents divorced when I was young, so I had a separate relationship with him. So he was the one who actually called to tell me that Alan had died.
Oh, okay.
Um, and yeah, it was a little bit of like, I call it kind of an anti-homecoming. Like
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
I kind of was thrust back into, you know, family dynamics that I hadn't experienced in over 10 years. And it's interesting when something like that happens because people tend to fall back into their historical roles and responsibilities. And so there was about a week in between when Alan died and when the funeral took place. And there was a lot of disagreement about what the funeral might look like and where he might be buried because my parents, you know, weren't together and they each had different ideas about where they would want him buried. And um, there was a lot of people kind of coming to me saying, "Hey, can you talk to them? Can you mediate?" And I thankfully was able to say no. I was like, "No." I said, "You know, this might be your last act of parenting of my brother, you know? The last thing that you can do for him as your parent as his parents is come together and figure this out without me helping." So, yeah, I mean, it was a painful time. His funeral ended up being really beautiful. So I mentioned his obsessions. People with Prader-Willi tend to have, kind of an obsessive behavior pattern, and one of his obsessions was Christmas, and so
Oh.
it's one of the most beautiful things about Alan was that he listened to Christmas music year round, and he would have, like, a Sony Walkman cassette player, like, on his hip belt, and he would listen t and he would sing along with the music. He had headphones on, and it sounded like shouting, like, his singing sounded like shouting. So he just would walk around the house kind of shouting Christmas music at us all the time. And so his funeral, they incorporated some Christmas carols, even though he passed away in August. So it was kind of an interesting juxtaposition of Christmas and summer, but they found a way to kind of honor his love of Christmas through some of the elements of his service, which was really nice.
It's been really interesting when I'm in situations now where I can tell that, like, a younger version of me would have been like, "I'll fix that," or this would have said yes to everything, and I go, well, my current self is like, "Nope, like, this is your problem," or like, it's not even your problem, it's just it's not my problem, right? Like, if you're having issues, like, unless if you're gonna ask me and it's, like, a legit thing, but it's been really interesting to it's almost sometimes it feels like an out of body experience where, like, I can see my younger self and I see my current self, and I'm like, "Yeah, like, they have different responses now." Which is really but that's the part that it makes me feel so good about my like, how I what I've been doing now to, like, get to that point because 'cause I'm like, "Wow, like, I would have never imagined me being able to say no to these people or whatever it is," and it's like, "Oh, like, this is nice because then I feel like the less I say yes to other people, the more I can just have my own space to do what I want, right? Or not do stuff that I right, like where I'm like, I'm just gonna sit and watch television and do nothing for like the next 3 hours because I can, because I felt like because I feel like when you're a kid and you're doing that, it's fine, but that's more of a you're doing it to like escape from your reality, or you're doing it to like procrastinate on the fact that, like, you have to help your sibling or something, but now I'm like, "No, I really just wanna watch this TV show and enjoy it." Like, there is, like, a psychological difference of, like, when you're intentionally taking time to do something that you want to do versus on behalf of somebody else.
Yeah, there's like a mindfulness element of it where the things that you're saying yes to are meaningful because you've like thought about it and this is what you've decided that you need in the moment. And I think the people who love you the most and care about you the most will appreciate that because I mean, nobody really wants you to say yes and then feel resentment, like nobody wants you to show up to something that you really don't wanna do or show up begrudgingly. At least, I mean, that's what I try to remind myself is, like, the things that I'm gonna say yes to and the ways that I'm gonna show up, I'm gonna do it because I really want to and because it's meaningful and because I can kind of be present versus, doing it out of a sense of guilt and obligation.
Yeah, which is I feel like a lot of things growing up were out of guilt and obligation, but that's I'm working through it, which is good. So now I can tell like if I start to feel those things, I'm like, nope, like let's check back in, let's reevaluate, and then like give a different answer or like just see where I'm at. But so for your book, so when did like how long did it take you to like write it? Like I mean, obviously like your brother dying is part of like the whole experience. But yeah, but like how like what was that process like and like how long did it take and things like that?
Yeah, yeah, I wouldn't say that I, like, initially thought, "Oh, I'm gonna write a book about this." I'm a professional writer, I've been a professional writer for 20 years, so writing has always been something that I'm doing, and when he died, it was a way to kind of document and process a lot of the aftermath and kind of, you know, because he died so suddenly, I had a lot of questions about what happened to him, which became questions of what happened to us and what was it like growing up with him. It's kind of like I was saying a few minutes ago, like when someone dies, you're left to kind of make meaning of it. So that's how the writing started, and then in 2018, so he passed in 2016. In 2018, I wrote an essay for the New York Times about it. Um, it's called "Mourning the Loss of a Sibling Rival," and I just wrote about because the thing that happened when he died is some people in my life said some things to me along the lines of, "Oh, are you relieved? Like, are you relieved that you're not gonna have to take care of him into old age?
Oh,
Is there a part
interesting.
of you that, like, is glad that this burden has been lifted?" And they said it in with different degrees of tact, but that was kind of the message, is they wondered if I felt relieved on any level, if I felt relieved, and the reality is I didn't, you know? I mean, of course, yes, I it did mean that I would not have to take care of him into old age, but I was sad, you know, just like anybody would be losing a sibling. So I wrote about that for the New York Times, and I felt like I was writing it for other siblings. I felt like the essay was gonna speak to other siblings, and I was really surprised. I heard back definitely from a lot of siblings who were really thankful and who resonated with the piece, but I also heard from people who grew up with siblings who suffered with addiction, with mental illness, with chronic medical conditions or terminal illnesses. I heard from a lot of people who just felt like they weren't seen or heard in their families growing up. And that surprised me, and it also encouraged me. I was like, "Wow, this is actually a much more of a universal experience than I realized." And so for me, that was kind of the final push that I need to go ahead and write the whole book, write the whole story. And so I worked on it for about the initial draft, probably a couple years, and then it was a long process of writing and revising. I was working full time while I was writing it. And then I worked with my literary agent on some final revisions, and the publishing world is um, an intimidating place, and it takes a long time. I mean, for some people, you know, it maybe they find a publisher immediately and it's a really quick process, but my experience is that it's kind of a lesson in endurance because it was probably about 5 years from the time I really started writing it until it was published. But the nice thing is that amount of time, like, I've done a lot of work in therapy. I've done a lot of work to process all of my feelings about my story, and so by the time the book came out, I was ready for it to be everyone else's story, if that makes sense, you
Oh, it
know?
does, it does, yeah.
It's kind of I've done enough work around this story. I'm ready to put it into the hands of the people who will benefit from reading it at this point and let the book kind of live in the world and do whatever it's gonna do, hopefully to help other people.
I'm a big advocate of everyone going to therapy. I mean, for Sibs, obviously there's obviously commonalities of stuff that we're working through, but I'm just a big advocate for it because it's like I've just personally benefited so much from the amount of work that I've put in to a variety of things, right? It changes so much of like, yeah, how you look back on your younger self, how you interact with like your family and other people, and it's like, I can I can be a better person and I can let go of stuff that I would have originally been very like, personally offended by or like, took personally or whatever. And it's a nice like yeah, that must be a really nice feeling to be like, nope, I wrote this. It's like, here you go. Like you've said what you've had to say, and it doesn't matter because you've already said it. It doesn't yeah, so that part must be super exciting.
I wanna say too that I think, like, a good therapist and it's hard to find a good therapist. I think sometimes you have to kind of it's like dating. I think sometimes you have to,
Yeah, you have to
try out
yeah.
several before you find a good match, but I think for me at least, a good therapist can give you some of the things that you didn't get as a kid, you know? They can give you that validation. They can't ever make up for, what did or didn't happen for you in childhood, but I think a good therapist can validate you, they can give you kind of that unconditional, um, positive regard that your parents are supposed to give you, but maybe they didn't have the energy to give you because they were so focused on your sibling. Um, they can, like we were talking about before, they can normalize your feelings and help you feel less alone with it.
Yeah, and it's your space to like process through your stuff, right? It's not like, oh, I'm gonna go into this room with like six other people. We're all gonna like take turns and share, right? Like you and your therapist, it's like you get to talk about stuff that like you there the amount of things that have come up that I did not know I had suppressed for like the better of 20 years. I was like, I didn't know I felt like that. Right? But my therapist has given me she's made the space safe enough for me to feel like I can talk about, right? And it's because we're working through all those things like through validation, her just listening to me talk about random things, right? And not random things that have hurt me in the past. It's like, oh, like it all connects. So by the time I get to stuff that's like, oh, I didn't know I felt like that way, but it all connects because and it makes sense with the trajectory of what I've been saying to her because it's I feel validated where I'm like, yeah, like that is true. And so when you're acknowledging your own feelings, you then have the pathway to like dig more stuff that's been just suppressed for so long. And it's crazy because I feel like as siblings, I mean like everybody suppresses feelings, right? That's just I think that's part of being a human, right? Because there's a time and place for certain things, but there's other things where I'm like, oh, like I didn't know I felt this way about these topics. And it's just so it because my sister was diagnosed when I would have been 4 or 5 at the time, right? And so when she's diagnosed and my mom sits down she told me that like, "Hey, your sister blah blah blah." But the thing is like the I won't say disadvantage. I think the difference between you finding out as an adult where you've already lived through it and versus me not having lived anything is that I then took that and went, "This is my life now." At the like, before it was even happening, right? And so there's all these things where I'm like, "Oh, but I'm gonna then take care of my sister out of, like, the obligation," right? Like, "Oh, I wanna be a good big sister, so therefore," like, at the age of 5 or 6, you already kind of you're telling yourself these things because you do want to be a good sister, right? And it's like, "What does that look like?" Nope, no 6-year-old knows that, and so you've kind of just suppressed the, like, "Oh, I wanna, like, go play with her," but, like, "Oh, I can't because she's doing this thing." Well, like, what if I did this, right? You're already at such a young age thinking about not yourself, and so all that childhood wants, right, they all kind of just fall underneath this carpet that after years and years, you kinda keep just piling more carpets because and it's not until someone else either you yourself or someone else says, "Hey, did you know you're not really taking care of yourself?" Right? And even then, it can't it's not even other people, right? Like you have to hit your own threshold of like, "Oh, I've realized now that I don't like my life the way it is."
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think of a lot of things like birth order. You know, since my brother was older than me, there was never I was born into a family that had already been rocked by disability, and I think as a kid, I didn't have the language for it, but I think I sensed that there was a before and after. There was a before there was a before that happened before I came to be, you know?
Yeah,
I
before
think
like you existed, yeah.
yeah, I could tell with my parents that there was, you know, this earthquake that had happened, and I was in the aftermath of it, you know? And that's language that I have now that I obviously, I didn't have that insight as a kid, but what you're talking about too is, yeah, I mean, it's for a lot of us, it's not until maybe we get into therapy or we get into adulthood that we have these kind of light bulb moments where it's like, "Oh, wait, I'm allowed to have feelings," or I mean, it's for a lot of siblings, I if they do go to therapy, it might be the first time that they've ever been in a room where somebody is that focused on them, you know, which could be scary. Um, but, you know, we grow up with so much energy and so much focus, even in the best families. I mean, I wanna say that a lot of parents are doing a really good job taking care of their typical kids alongside of their kids with disability, and they're doing a lot to make the typical siblings feel seen and loved. But even in those best situations, the typical kid watches all this medical attention and all this focus and time go toward their sibling, and so, yeah, it's kinda wild to get to adulthood, and then, like, the beauty is if you're willing to look at these things. I like the image that you said about just, like, sweeping things under the carpet and then adding more carpets on top. If you're willing to, like, peel back those carpets, for me, it makes me really happy to think about, like, how that's gonna impact all of your relationships going forward, whether or not you have a partner, whether or not you ever choose to have kids, but, like, you are changing the trajectory of all your relationships that you're gonna have from now on.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that's been really like I've been very excited about is knowing that like I like stuff is going to be different than like how I grew up and stuff like that. And right, it's not like my parents did a bad job or anything, right? But there's certain things like they did what they could given the resources they had at that time, right? And at that time, it was just different than now, which is different than 20 years before I existed, right? And so given that like okay, they did what they could and it's like, well, now like I'm setting myself up with tools so that like whoever I'm interacting with, like it's gonna be different. Like I'm gonna show up different because I'm gonna care about myself first and then you. Instead of me going, I'm gonna go about you first and then put me at the bottom of the ladder. Right. And even that yeah, when you just interact with like your coworkers, just people on the street, whatever, right? That already changes it when you care about yourself more, you're like, okay, you do show up different. And in a way that's it's and I think it's this perception, right, of when we're growing up and we think like, oh, I want to do this. We feel like, oh, it's like this big monster in the room, right? Like, oh, like I'm gonna be this monster and like gonna ruin everyone's lives. But when you're an adult, you're like, no, you need to be that, but it's you're just equal with every other human in the room, right? It's not you being like rude or obnoxious or whatever, right? You vocalizing yourself actually just makes you a regular person, but in like growing up, it vocalizing makes it really makes it feel like, oh, like I'm Bigfoot and then I'm gonna like destroy all of you, right? And I don't know what causes that, but it feels like that on the inside. We're
Yeah.
like, "Oh, I'm taking up too much space. I need to, like, suppress."
For a lot of us, I think it felt like there was a limited amount of resources available as a kid, and so if you ask for more and take up more space, then you're somehow taking away from your sibling or taking up, so it did probably feel like you were a monster kind of gobbling up. But yeah, it's kind of amazing to be an adult and especially like in corporate settings or work settings, like I am always well, and I'll say this as a parent too, I am always amazed when people just ask for what they need, like it's no big deal. And I'm like, "Wait, like, it's okay to do that?" And having kids, having my own kids was really therapeutic too because I got to see them just express their needs and their emotions without hesitation the way kids are supposed to do,
I
you
was like
know?
"Is that what it's supposed to be like?" I have, like,
Yeah,
no idea. I have no idea.
and it's beautiful, and then I could meet their needs, and so the other thing I wanna say back to what you said a minute ago, I think we can have a lot of compassion for our parents, and we can recognize that they did the best they could with the resources they had, and it wasn't enough, like, I think we can kind of acknowledge that they did the best they could, and also we needed more.
We yeah, and we did. We all did. That's why we're all currently seeing therapists, like, 'cause it's true, right? Like, it's just we wanted the undivided attention, right? We didn't wanna be the ones who, like, picked up all the extra sticks after, like, they fell down after the first time, right? Like, it was hard, and it's like, they parents I don't know at that time what it was like, I don't know, like, as a child, right, I don't know if parents at that point had tools to be able to say, like, "Hey, it's okay," and whatever, right? Like, I don't it's just a bit because it depends how they grew up, right? But it's the tools that parents have now will at least increase that percentage a little bit, 'cause it's it's been so fascinating, right? As I talk to people who are well, I mean, kind of all in the same age range-ish in terms of, like, generationally, like, right, like, we all as, like, working adults now, like, it's we all kinda grew up in this era of, like, well, it's yeah, like, they're like, we needed more attention, right? We needed more attention on us and, like, validation. We need to be heard, seen, and loved, right, by our parents, and it's the unfortunate part is, like, no matter how hard we try and they try now, as we're all adults between the ages of 20 and 50 or whatever, like, you can't get that time back. Like, it doesn't matter if they, like, take you to Disneyland now or whatever, right? It doesn't make up for, like, the 6-year-old version of me who needed, like, my mom in the middle of the night and, like, they're too tired, right? Like, that doesn't make up for it. And that's, like, something I'm working through now, right? It's kinda like this, I think, like, I have to be able to, like to give that to myself, and I have to give it to the 6-year-old version of me who's still kind of in this, like, "Wait, but, like, I'm not as important as all these other people," right? And that's hard because well, for I don't know if this is, like, a sibling thing or a me thing or not, but maybe you can speak to it or not, but it's I wanted validation from everybody because if I couldn't get it from my parents, I'm like, "I'm gonna do well in school and get it from them. I'm gonna, like, go to like, this, like, whatever gymnastics or swimming and gonna do good job and get all these medals and whatever," right? But the hard part is, like, I had, like, a whole shelf full of stuff, right? And it's like, that's not what I needed, right? I just needed my parents to, like, stop what they were doing and go, like, "We love you," and, like, well, I didn't get that, but that's what I needed, and I needed them just to stop and give me the undivided attention for no reason, right? Not because I got an award, not because I got an A, not because I like, oh, I managed to jump and not hurt myself, right? I needed the random hug that out of nowhere that's just like we love you. And that's what I was missing, right? But that's what we all needed and still need actually. Like
Yeah, and there's a grieving process that you have to go through because, yeah, you can't go back in time and get those needs met, and for me so there's grief in that, and I think it's healthy to kind of acknowledge that, and then you can, as you said, we can do it for ourselves, and we have to as adults, we have to learn to meet those needs for ourselves, but that kinda makes me angry too because 'cause I'm like, "Wait, like, this is like, I already did all the things. I already did so much as a kid, and now you're telling me I also have to take care of myself, you know? Like, it's up to me again, and so, for me, the grief is just kind of layered, and I yes, to answer your question, I totally sought validation. I was a amazing student. I realized I could get some of my needs met by being seen at school, and I could get attention and nurturing from teachers, and so I sought that through academics, and then I also got it, you know, at friends' houses, even though I never talked about I never, like, told anybody how difficult things were at home, but I would just savor like, if I got invited to a play date and I went to somebody's house and their mom made me a sandwich and,
yeah.
uh that I just soaked that up like a sponge.
I oh man, the one I remember, which I like at the time, there's some other things with this, but the takeaway is like, one of my friends, so she had this, so we're all like, I think she was turning 8. It was like her 8 year, it was like her 8th birthday party, right? And her mom, like, she face painted everybody. And like in a like full thing, not just like, oh, it's like, the ones at a fair where it's like, it's like 2 inches and that's it. She did like a full everything, and I was like, "Wait, like, her mom is just doing that, right?" And she made dinner, she looked at and I was like, "Th" I was just, like, in awe of, like, "Wait, other families, like, they make snacks and we can, like, run around, they put movies." Yeah, it was so different. is there anything else you would like to talk about?
I mean, I think what you just said is a big part of it. I think if you can kind of expand your idea of what family looks like and find your committee, I like to call my closest supporters and friends my committee, the people who you can kind of get some of those needs met. You can't it's not ever one person that's gonna meet all your needs, and you have to meet your own, but I think you can learn to kind of have a support committee that you can go to and people who will validate you, who, will love you, who are gonna not silver line everything or make you feel like you have to always express gratitude, but make room for the more painful feelings too.
Yeah. Go watch Inside Out, everybody.
Yes.
It's such a good I said that, like, on a previous yeah, I said that, like, on my last recording too, which people are gonna hear it 2 days in a row, but you know what? It's a great movie to illustrate the thoughts about having yeah, being able to hold more than one feeling, like, that's
Yeah.
it's such an important yeah, it's such an important thing, and having other people say, like, "It's okay, you can feel all those things."
Mhm. Right.
Yeah.
I'm actually starting a list of movies and books where that get the sibling relationship right.
Oh,
So if
so
you ever think
exciting.
of any and wanna send them to me, but I I feel like I wanna collect like representation in media of sibling really, typical and disabled siblings, that kind of get that dynamic right because there's not a lot of them.
Yeah, but I love that idea. I'm excited for that.
Well, I'll keep you posted.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks for listening to the Special Needs Sibling Podcast. I hope you have a good time listening and feel encouraged in your own journey as a sibling to someone with special needs. If you liked this episode, please share it with your friends. And if you want to hear more stories, please subscribe to the show. You can find us wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, the show can't happen without you. All special needs siblings have their own unique stories, challenges, family dynamics, and lots of life to talk about and explore. This podcast is here to let you know that you're not alone and that you matter. If you would like to be on the show or just chat off the record, please contact me. My info is in the show notes. Until next time, this is the Special Needs Sibling Podcast.